from 3 days to 20. We'll now show you the debate from earlier today. It runs an hour and a half.
Mr. Chairman, I am pleased that today we are considering H.R. 8, the Bipartisan Background Checks Act of 2019. We have promised the American people that Congress would take steps to reduce gun violence, and this bill is a critical first step toward doing so. During the past 4 weeks, as the Judiciary Committee and now the full House have discussed the issue of gun violence, I have cited grim statistics. Nearly 40,000 Americans lost their lives because of guns in 2017. In fact, every day in America, on average, 34 people are murdered with a firearm, and more than 183 people are injured in an attack. Gun violence of this magnitude is a distinctly American problem. A country-to-country comparison is shocking. For example, in 2011, the United Kingdom had 146 deaths due to gun violence, Denmark, 71, Portugal, 142, and Japan, just 30. The United States, that year, about 35,000. A recent study in the American Journal of Medicine found that compared to 22 other high-income countries, the gun-related murder rate in the United States is 25 times higher. Even when you adjust for population differences, Americans are disproportionately killed by gun violence. Almost 25 years to the day after the Brady Act was first implemented, expanding our current background check requirement to cover virtually all gun transfers is one of the steps we must take to address this crisis. Under current law, only licensed firearms dealers are required to conduct a background check before transferring a gun to another person. This means that gun shows, online sales, and other private sales can completely evade this vital tool for ensuring that guns do not get into the wrong hands. It is time to close this dangerous loophole. This bill would make it illegal for any person who is not a licensed firearm importer, manufacturer, or dealer to transfer a firearm to any other person who is not so licensed without a background check. Individuals seeking to transfer a firearm under this measure would be required to visit a licensed firearms dealer to run the necessary background check before the transfer could be finalized. The bill also provides a number of exceptions to this requirement, including gifts to family members and transfers for hunting, target shooting, and instances of imminent death or great bodily harm. The FBI's internal assessment demonstrated that checks processed through the National Instant Criminal Background Check System, often called NICS, are approximately 99.3% to 99.8% accurate. And in 90% of cases, the background checks are completed within 90 seconds. H.R. 8 will provide an accurate and speedy mechanism to help ensure firearms do not end up in the wrong hands. There is no reason to continue to make it easy for people who are legally prohibited from possessing firearms to acquire them by circumventing the background check process. H.R. 8 would close this dangerous loophole and save many, many lives. That is why I urge my colleagues to vote in favor of this vital legislation today. I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Georgia.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today I rise in strong opposition to H.R. 8, the so-called Bipartisan Background Checks Act. This bad legislation that fails to make anyone safer in any regard. I've been listening here and sitting on the floor for just the last few minutes and listening to those who came up and were happy about this bill coming forward today, and they mentioned many acts of mass violence and situations that have happened. The sad part about it is they claim this is the answer and the first step. Their actuality is it's at best a sidestep and may actually be a step backwards and will not do what is being claimed to do. All this legislation will do is burden law-abiding citizens wishing to exercise their Second Amendment rights, including defending themselves from the gun-toting criminals this bill does nothing to combat. H.R. 8 foolishly presumes criminals who flawed existing laws will suddenly submit themselves to background checks. Are members who support this bill delusional enough to think that criminals trading cocaine to another criminal for a firearm will give consideration to H.R. 8 and go to the nearest gun store to submit to a background check? That's absurd. And most of us will agree that criminals are not going to do that anyway. My concern is what it actually does in practice to those who are not criminals. Not only is it foolish to think they will start following the law, this is also foolish to think it's going to, in many ways, make our country safer. My Democratic friends exploited every mass shooting, calling for universal background checks. But H.R. 8 would not have stopped a single mass shooting. These tragedies do, however, share one thing in common. Over and over we see issues of mental health and missed opportunities for authorities to intercede. Let me just say, Mr. Speaker, I share the concern, and I'm going to share in just a moment actual real things that actually could make a difference in helping to stem the tide of mass violence in our country. But doing this, we have to understand that this bill does not do that, and what may make you feel good may not heal you, and that has to be understood. Look at the recent workplace shooting in Illinois where the gunman murdered 5 people. That could have been prevented, but not by H.R. 8. All law enforcement had to do was enforce existing law. The gunman was prohibited from possessing firearms. In January 2014, he was issued an Illinois firearms owner's identification card. That March, he applied to buy a handgun from a gun dealer. 5 days later, he took possession of the gun, having inexplicably passed a background check. That month, he applied for a concealed carry permit. During a background check for the permit, his felony conviction was flagged. Illinois police revoked his firearm card and sent him a letter telling him to relinquish the firearm. Not surprisingly, the felon did not comply. Had authorities seized the firearm between March 2014 and February 2019, they could have saved 5 lives. Aurora, Illinois is not the only in missed opportunities to prevent tragedy. We know about missed opportunities in Parkland, Aurora, Colorado, Southern Springs, Virginia Tech, and others. The common problem here, Mr. Speaker, is clear. It's not a lack of background checks. With H.R. 8, Democrats refuse to acknowledge the human factors leading to these events, but Republicans have a bill to help law enforcement coordinate responses to mental health concerns and other mass violent threat information. You know what else H.R. 8 doesn't address? The primary ways criminals acquire firearms. Last month, DOJ revealed nearly half of criminals obtain firearms via theft or black market. The survey also revealed that a mere 0.8% of criminals purchase their firearms at gun shows. So if this bill won't prevent mass shootings and address violent crime, what will it do? It will keep law-abiding citizens from protecting themselves. Under this bill, Mr. Speaker, a battered woman with a protection order against her abuser who borrows a firearm for self-defense would be a criminal. It would criminalize the selling of a firearm without a background check to someone with a valid permit allowing them to possess, acquire, or carry a firearm. If that person walked into a gun store, they could present that permit and not undergo a NICS check. On the other hand, there are solutions to prevent mass violence and gun crime. The Mass Violence Prevention Act, which I introduced earlier this week, is one. The MVP Act directly addresses challenges in law enforcement coordination and response. It would reduce the flow of firearms into the black market, and it would bolster law enforcement's ability to prosecute criminals for firearm offenses. If reducing gun violence, Mr. Speaker, is the Democrats' concern, the MVP Act is legislation that should be considering today, not H.R. 8. Talk to me or my staff about co-sponsoring this evidence-based, common-sense legislation. Unlike H.R. 8, the MVP Act could have prevented tragedies such as Parkland. Unfortunately, Mr. Speaker, my Democratic colleagues, by putting forward this and continuing the same narrative, are not actually interested in stopping gun violence. I take the intent to be good. I do not question the motive. All of us in our life do not want to see the tragedies unfold. But this is not the way forward. This is another thing put out to the very ones who have suffered, telling them we're helping them, while at the same point not telling them the truth about the bill. A bill that guts its own ability to enforce itself, a bill that actually would keep possibly people from purchasing firearms because of an unlimited price of a background check. The questions that I have about this bill, Mr. Speaker, is not what actually could happen with this, it's what actually will be hurt by this as we move forward. And with that, I believe they were being misled. The victims of mass violence are being misled by this bill, H.R. 8, because it would not stop what they have been promised it would stop. And for that, I'm profoundly sorry, but because of that, my colleagues I call on them to reject H.R. 8 and support real solutions while I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from New York.
Mr. Chairman, I now yield 2 minutes to the gentlelady from California, the chairperson of the Crime Subcommittee, Ms. Bass.
The gentlelady is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you. Mr. Chair, I rise in strong support of H.R. 8, the Bipartisan Background Checks Act of 2019, which will extend the current federal background check requirement to unlicensed sellers of guns. It is about time that Congress takes this issue seriously, and I'm pleased that this bipartisan bill has been brought to the House floor with the urgency this issue deserves. In recent years, our nation has experienced an increase in mass shootings, and our nation is appropriately horrified. However, mass shootings are just one symptom of our gun violence epidemic. The daily toll of shootings occurs in communities across our country, on our streets, in our schools, and even in our houses of worship. As Ayala Eastman testified before the Judiciary Committee earlier this month, 1 year after the terrible shooting that took the lives of 17 students and staff and injured 17 others at her high school in Parkland, Florida, minority communities bear the heaviest brunt of gun violence in this country. And the impact of our young people is simply unacceptable. Every day, 47 children and teens are shot in this country. 8 of these young people die, and 39 are shot and survived. Citizens across this country, such as Diane Latiker, who also testified before the committee, are taking it upon themselves to organize and engage in community-based efforts to reduce gun violence and assist the young people it affects. But we in Congress must match their courage and commitment with action of our own. I support H.R. 8 because it will reduce gun violence by narrowing the avenues for criminals and others prohibited persons from obtaining guns. Certainly, there is no single change to our gun laws that will prevent every shooting, but enacting measures that will help prevent some of them is clearly the right thing to do. That is why I support this bill, and I ask my colleagues to do the same. I yield back the balance of my time.
Kelly yields back. The gentleman from Georgia.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Unfortunately, this bill does not narrow. In fact, it continues the process of those who are going to receive guns, and many of the daily toll that we see is actually coming from those who are already violating laws currently on the books. It's time we actually enforce those as well. But with that, I yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from California, Mr. McClintock.
The gentleman is recognized for 2 minutes.
I thank the gentleman for yielding, Mr. Chairman. H.R. 8 is brought to us by the same groups and politicians who've made no secret of their desire to ultimately strip law-abiding citizens of their right to defend themselves. Now, they can't do that outright. They know that. So they do it through cynical measures like this, which weave a web of laws so intricate that sooner or later everyone can be caught up in them. This law affects not just transfer of ownership, but any transfer of weapon for any period of time. So suppose you exchange shotguns with a friend on a hunt and then separate for a period of time. Or you loan a gun to your next-door neighbor of 20 years who's being victimized by a stalker. Or you give a gun to your stepson or your great-grandson. Under any of these innocent scenarios, and countless more like them, you're guilty of a federal crime. These flaws were all pointed out to the bill's sponsors, and none were addressed. Why not? I think the reason should be obvious. Last October, a 10-year study by Johns Hopkins and UC Davis concluded that California's universal background check law had no effect on gun homicides or suicides, none. The purpose of this bill is not public safety. That's just a deceptive facade. Its true purpose is to make gun ownership so legally hazardous, so fraught with legal booby traps and draconian penalties that no honest and law-abiding citizen would want to take the risk of gun ownership. Most criminals already get their guns illegally and are unconstrained by laws like this. Make no mistake, this is aimed squarely at law-abiding citizens, moving us closer to a society where decent people are defenseless and armed criminals are kings. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from New York.
Mr. Chairman, I now yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Rhode Island, Mr. Cicilline, a member of the committee.
Gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, we have a gun violence epidemic in this country, and for 8 years, we've marked it with moments of silence and doing nothing, saying nothing and doing nothing, but today that changes with passage of H.R. 8 for universal background checks. We know universal background checks work because since the passage of the Brady Bill, 3.5 million illegal gun sales were prevented. But of course, there's a huge loophole. Millions and millions of gun sales happen without a background check at all. In fact, 1 in 5, 22% of guns are sold with no background check. That means criminals, domestic abusers, people prohibited due to mental illness can get a gun. This bill changes that. We also know that states that have enhanced background checks have lower rates of gun homicides, gun suicide rates, and gun trafficking. This is a common sense bill to protect the American people from the scourge of gun violence. Finally, after 8 years of pleading with our Republican colleagues to do something about gun violence in this country, to take up a bill, we had a sit-in to try to force a vote. Finally today, we're taking our first step to reduce gun violence in this country by passing H.R. 8. Finally, we will see members of Congress standing up to the power of the gun lobby and doing what's right for the American people. I urge my colleagues to vote yes. And with that, I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. Gentleman from New York reserves. Gentleman from Georgia.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I would remind the Speaker that we did pass Fix NICS last year. We did take into account those. Those things have been done. We just simply are not moving a bill that we don't feel works, and we have actually offered an alternative. With that, I yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Arizona, Mr. Biggs.
I'm grateful,
Mr.
Chairman, that the gentleman would yield. And, Mr. Chairman, I'll tell you that H.R. 8 will do little more than further burden law-abiding gun owners. Without an unconstitutional federal gun registry, this bill is impossible to enforce. There is no gun show loophole. Federal law is the same regardless of where a firearm sale takes place. Federal law requires all firearms dealers to be licensed and to initiate a background check before transferring a firearm to a non-dealer, regardless of where that transfer takes place. As for non-dealers, federal law prohibits transferring a firearm to anyone known or believed to be prohibited from possessing firearms. That's already the law. According to DOJ, less than 1% of criminals in state prison for firearm crimes get their firearms from dealers or non-dealers at gun shows. According to ATF, 6% of federal armed career criminals got their firearms from dealers or non-dealers at gun shows. Only 6%. Online sales loophole. There is no online sales loophole. The federal law is the same regardless of how people communicate about selling or buying a firearm. Federal law prohibits anyone, licensed firearm dealer or not, from shipping a firearm to a person who lives in another state, unless the receiver is also a dealer. Dealers must document all firearms they receive. H.R. 8 also fails to include many of the realistic exceptions to the new background check requirements for private transfers, such as transfers between law enforcement officers outside of their duties, transfer to concealed carry permit holders, transfers to museums or licensed collectors, transfers to active duty military, and many more. H.R. 8 includes an exception to the background check transfer if the transfer is necessary to prevent imminent death or great bodily harm. But that transfer is only allowed for the length of time that it's necessary to prevent imminent death or great bodily harm, but it doesn't even define those terms. What about a false alarm? Does it extend to domestic violence fears if the person is not getting attacked immediately? Gun rights groups have argued that without a definition, this provision would only provide protection in instances where it is likely too late for the victim to make it out safely. Finally, H.R. 8 would not have prevented any of the recent high-profile shootings. In those cases, the shooter either passed a federal background check or stole the firearms they used. My time has expired. Thank you.
Gentleman from Georgia reserves. A gentleman from New York.
Mr. Chairman, I now yield 2 minutes to the distinguished gentleman from California, the chief author of this legislation and the chairman of the Gun Violence Prevention Task Force, Mr. Thompson.
Gentleman is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank the gentleman for yielding. Speaker, I rise in strong support of my bill, H.R. 8, the Bipartisan Background Check Act of 2019. First, I'd like to thank Speaker Pelosi and Chairman Nadler for their support. Gun violence is a true national emergency, and I'm glad that we're moving so early in this Congress to address this crisis. I'd also like to thank my colleagues on the other side of the aisle who recognize the importance of passing this legislation. Representatives King, Fitzpatrick, Mass, Upton, and Smith, who stand with over 90% of Americans who support universal background checks. This bill will require a background check on all firearm sales and most transfers. Mr. Speaker, I'm a lifelong gun owner. I'm a hunter. I support the Second Amendment. If this bill did anything to erode the rights of lawful gun owners, I wouldn't support it and it wouldn't have my name on it. Background checks work. Every day, they stop 170 felons and 50 domestic abusers from getting a gun from a licensed dealer. But in some states, those same people can go into a gun show or go online and buy a gun without a background check. This bill will help stop them from doing so. Some will argue that criminals won't follow the law. If that's the case, then why do we have laws against murder? People still commit murder. Why do we have laws against stealing? People still steal. This is flawed logic, and don't fall for it. This bill is supported by law enforcement, medical professionals, veterans, gun owners, religious leaders, and the millions of Americans who took to the streets in support of H.R. 8. I ask that my colleagues support this bill and honor the lives lost with action. No more moments of silence with no action to follow. Today, your thoughts and your prayers aren't enough. Today, you can vote yes. I yield back to balance my time.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from New York reserves. Gentleman from Georgia.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. At this time, I yield 5 minutes to the gentleman from Colorado, Mr. Buck.
Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
I thank the gentleman from Georgia for yielding to me. And Mr. Chairman, I rise to oppose H.R. 8, a bill that criminalizes gun transfers between law-abiding citizens who have no criminal record and no criminal intent. The bill includes several flawed and unworkable exceptions. Take the law enforcement exception. It allows the police to transfer a firearm, but criminalizes transfers to law enforcement. Under this bill, a parent whose child finds a gun in a park commits a federal crime if the parent surrenders the gun to police. Under this bill, a citizen commits a federal crime if they participate in a local gun buyback program. Under this bill, an attorney commits a federal crime when they turn a client's gun over to the police to clear the client through ballistics testing. Will criminalizing cooperation with law enforcement make us safer? The majority apparently thinks so, and I think it's crazy. The Democrats' bill gives special privileges to the bodyguards of the wealthy elite, like former Mayor Bloomberg, who is funding the special interest advocacy for this bill. He can afford to hire bodyguards, but average Americans who rely on the Second Amendment as their source of personal protection are not given similar protections. Nothing should be more offensive to this body than a bill that denies citizens their endowed rights while giving wealthy elites special protections, privileges, dispensations. But that's H.R. 8. Take the family exception. The rule allows a vote on an amendment to ensure that transfers between parent and child include step-parents and stepchildren. What about transfers between a foster parent and foster child? This bill says foster relationships are not worthy of the same respect and equal treatment. Every member of this body should be ashamed to vote for this bill that reflects such terrible policy and discrimination. Take the Good Samaritan exception, allowing transfers where a threat of death or harm is imminent. Imminent means death is menacingly near, a standard so strict that it's frankly too late to transfer a gun once it's obvious a gun is needed for protection. Under this standard, it is illegal to loan a gun to a victim of domestic violence for her protection until the transferor is practically witnessing a murder in progress. This standard would also prevent a gun owner who has intermittent suicidal thoughts, a known side effect of certain prescription medications, from legally transferring a gun, his own gun, to a friend for safekeeping. Because this bill criminalizes transfers between law-abiding Americans while doing nothing to curb criminals' access to guns, this bill provides the American public with a false sense of security. Because this bill includes unworkable exceptions that will mislead people into thinking a gun transfer is legal when it is not, this bill provides law-abiding gun owners with a false sense of immunity. Mr. Chairman, I urge a no vote on this totally and completely unconstitutional legislation that will deprive people of their constitutional rights to keep and bear arms. And I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Georgia reserves. Gentleman from New York.
Mr. Speaker, I now yield 2.5 minutes to the gentlelady from Georgia, Ms. McBath. A member of the committee, Ms. McBath.
Gentlelady is recognized for 2.5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Nadler, and thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today marks a very pivotal moment in our fight to prevent gun violence and to ensure the safety of every community across our nation. Thank you to the more than 230 of our colleagues who have co-sponsored H.R. 8, the Bipartisan Background Checks Act of 2019. Thank you to you, Mr. Chairman Nadler, Speaker Pelosi, and Congressman Thompson and Congressman King. Thank you so much for making gun violence prevention a priority in this Congress. I am so proud to be an original co-sponsor of this historic legislation. As many of you may know, gun violence is an issue that is deeply personal for me. Gun violence prevention and a desire to make meaningful change is the very reason I am here today, in this legislative body, speaking to every one of you. In 2012, my son Jordan Davis was shot and killed by a man who opened fire on a car of unarmed teenagers at a gas station in Jacksonville, Florida, and my son was only 17 years of age. Jordan would have turned 24 this month. After my son's death, I dedicated my entire life to advocating for common sense gun safety solutions,